Hello, guys. I am here today to answer some of your questions from my book, 2020. Again, I am Josh Scherrer, and I'm the author of that book. And as you can see, I have your questions here on my phone. So I'm going to do my best to answer them from the month of April, I think was the chapter. So first off, Jada asked, what made Mr. Harrison want to die? Why did he stop trying to fight and just gave in? And so the best answer to that is that Mr. Harrison, if you remember, was infected, but he was not totally unaware of who he was as a human. And so the best answer for that would be he was conflicted. He did not want to become this animal. He knew what he did to his wife, but at the same time, he knew that he couldn't really control his actions anymore. And so I think that's why he stopped fighting, just so that way the decision could be made from someone else, because he wasn't capable of making that decision. Good question. Next, we have Kayla, who asks, how did the writer come up with the setting, and how did that lead up to what was really going on? And so I can tell you that, and this type of question comes up a little bit later too, but any good writer, or any writer in general, will write things based on what they know. And so the setting is actually based on the region, the area where I live or lived a few years ago. And so I changed some of the names of like the streets and things, and changed the names of neighbors or whatever, but it's all based on a real area, and then you just fictionalize it. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. Hannah asks, does he have some kind of disease or sickness because he seems a little weird? If you are referring to Mr. Harrison, yes, he probably had the disease. We don't really know exactly what it is yet in the early chapters, but he was probably afflicted. And if you're talking about Marlon, Marlon acts a little bit weird too, and we'll see kind of why he acts that way, what's going on in his mind as we go through his journal. Brianna asked, my question is, did the author use real companies in the story to make the reader see that the book was trying to be realistic, or that the author was trying to connect the world to the book? Another good question. So if you'll notice in movies or in other books that you read, sometimes you will see real companies being used in those, and sometimes you'll see that the movies or the books use companies that sound like a real company, but they don't use the actual name. And so whenever I was writing the book, I had to do a lot of research on what was legal and what was not legal whenever you use a real company or a real person in a book. And so the bottom line is, if you can avoid it, don't use any real names of individuals. Individuals have different rights than do companies. And as far as using company names, pretty much what I've found is that if you use a company name, you have to be willing to give credit to that company. In other words, you can't say anything bad about the company. So, for example, a little bit later in the book, I'll use Walmart. You can say Walmart, or they went to Walmart, or whatever. You just can't say that Walmart was a bad company, or that something happened that was negative because of the actual company, Walmart. And usually, it kind of depends on the size of the company as well. Walmart is a huge company. Everybody's familiar with Walmart. And so it's kind of like saying Kleenex instead of facial tissue. Walmart is just this thing that permeates across our culture. But for other smaller companies that I had to base my fictional companies on, I changed the names of those because, again, they were smaller and not as well known. So the next question comes from Benjamin, and he says, my question is, are the government going to keep sending soldiers to try to kill the people with the disease, or are they also getting scientists to try and develop a cure? And so actually, Benjamin, that will be addressed later on in the book. I think probably in the chapter December. So stay tuned for that one. Cecilia asked, if the government is going to send soldiers to kill the citizens, my question is, do the citizens really have a disease, or is it just an excuse to kill them because they've gone crazy? And I think that's an excellent question, Cecilia. We don't really know at this point in the book. We want to trust the government of the book, but then again, things are a little bit strange. You would think that maybe the police or the fire department or emergency services or somebody would respond, but we don't hear anyone. I think Marlon says in his journal that he heard sirens a couple days, he heard helicopters a couple of times, but that was it. And so we don't really know why there has been no official response. It's kind of a mystery at this point. Eric asks, my question I would like to ask is if the family is going to be okay. And he says that he read that the family was in a lodge and they're probably away from people, but they could have been sharing the lodge with others. And I think that's a really good question, especially because it sort of is related to what we in our world today are experiencing now in terms of self-isolation. So his family does go to Barclay Lodge at the beginning of the book. We don't actually see them leave or anything in the book, but we know that they're there, or at least that's where they were headed. And so, yeah, in theory, just like with the pandemic that we have today, if you are not around as many people, it's going to limit your exposure. And if it limits your exposure, the chances are that you will be safer from the disease than if you were around a lot of people. So I think that's an excellent question. Chelsea asked, if it came to running out of food or bullets while practicing this crisis, what would you do? And so, again, a few years ago, even last year, that question would have been based on what Marlon was experiencing in the book. But I can tell you that with the crisis that we have now, the COVID-19 pandemic, I had to tell one of my children today, he wanted a straw for his milk. And so I had to explain to him about conserving our resources and conserving straws, conserving whatever, because we can't just go out and get more. And so with Marlon Hartman, one of the things that he has to do is he has to ration what he has in order to ensure that he does maintain enough for an extended period of time. But even then, the question becomes, well, if you run out, what do? You can go without ammunition. It's not as safe, but you can do it. But you can't go without food for very long. So are you going to be willing to risk your life to try and find more food? And where will you go? And so Marlon wrestles with that question a lot in the book. So the next question is from Fabiola. Do you think that whoever tried to bite your jugular is someone who might have lost all memory and is going crazy? And then follow up, and what is a jugular? So good question. The jugular is your neck right here, and you have an artery and a vein that run up to your brain. And so it is one of the main circulatory systems that you have as far as your arteries and your veins. And so if that is punctured, then you bleed out pretty quick and you die. So the reason why I use that in the book is because in nature, you will see lions or wolves or coyotes when they're hunting prey, they always go for the most lethal part of the attack, and that is to attack the jugular of their prey. And the reason being is they want to eat, they need to eat, and they want to expend as little energy as possible. So the faster you can kill your prey, the faster you get to eat. And so in the book, whenever the person attacks the jugular, and then when smoke attacks at the jugular, I think later on, that is going to be a sign that it's very vicious, but also that it is an animalistic kill, if that makes sense. Good question. The next question that I've got is from Carla. And this one also is related to the world we live in now. And Carla asks, do the people in the story have to stay inside? And so the short answer to that is no, they don't have to. There's no order that they have to. But would they want to? Most likely. If you could stay inside, you probably would, especially if you heard screams and you heard all of these horrible sounds. Chances are, unless you're very adventurous, you're not going to just wander out and see what's going on. But again, kind of like today, is it safe to go outside? Yes. You have to take a lot of precautions? Yes. And so that's sort of the same thing that's going on in the book. Marcella asked, is the story based on something that happened in the past or not? And so actually later on in the book, we will see that Marlon discovers that what's going on is actually related to something that was going on in the real world in 2013, whenever I wrote the book. And those were actually attacks that humans were having on other humans that were really unusual, very strange. But those were actually going on in the news whenever I got the idea for the book, and I adopted those attacks into part of the story. So sort of, yes, this is based on something that was real, but really I took a real like nugget of information and made it completely fiction. Nira asked, are there certain stages of the TBR infection? And the reason why that was asked is because Mr. Harrison was halfway human when Marlon killed him, but Marlon killed the other guy, and that other guy seemed like he was completely infected and taken over his whole body. And so, yes, just like any other illness, an illness takes a while to invade and infect your entire body. It progresses, and so with Mr. Harrison, he still had his human consciousness. With the other guy, we don't know if he had, a consciousness, a humanness trapped inside of his mind or not. And so that's something that throughout the book, Marlon really wrestles with is, are these people who he later calls roamers, are they human? Or are they animals? Or are they, even really alive? Are they dead? What are they? So, we don't really use the word zombie in the book because Marlon believes that they are more than these undead creatures that have no life in them. But he wrestles with, what are you really supposed to do with these people? Good question. Addison asked, did Marlon find his wife and his kids? And if he did the virus, was it still going on? And what would he do if it was still going on? And so that's one of the major themes of the book is Marlon's search for his family. And so we'll see by the end of the book how he resolves that theme, how he resolves that crisis. So stay tuned for that one. Dylan asked, what is going to happen next? Well, that is the million-dollar question. We will see throughout the book that Marlon is going to not only move physically throughout the United States, but he will move almost spiritually, mentally, emotionally throughout the book. He will progress as he goes. At first he's just scared and he wants to get out. But then we'll see kind of what happens as he goes through this. Tabitha asked, what happened to the Randolphs and why were they just wandering instead of attacking Marlon's parents? And so that's another good question, and it's one that we don't really have an answer to. Even though I'm the author, sometimes characters kind of do things that we don't really understand, and so it's up to the reader to decide, why were they doing that? What was the value of putting that in the book? And so I'm just going to kind of leave that one there for you to kind of think on. Jory asked, what will you do once you run out of the supplies, such as food and gasoline, and what changes will you have to go through to fill these needs? And so it's kind of like the other question. You have to ration, But even with rationing, you have to decide what is important to you and what is not. What are your priorities? And then how are you going to meet those priorities? So for Marlon, we'll have to see in his journey what steps does he take to ensure his own survival and at what cost? Because whenever he is trying to survive, there will be consequences to that survival. And so that's one of the main themes of the book. Maria asked, the story just tells us about where it's from and what will happen when you get the disease, but it never tells us how they get infected and if they don't eat each other. And so as we go through the book, especially again, once we get to the chapter in December, we will see a lot of why the TBR infection is the way it is. And so it's one of those, you got to stay tuned, keep reading, and you'll figure out kind of what is going on with the infections. Javon asked, why did you separate him and his family? Well, that's an old author's trick. If you want to create conflict, the easiest way to do that is to create some sort of separation between the protagonist, or in this case, Marlon, and whatever he's seeking out. So if he and his family were together, we could still have a book, but it would be more about how the family survived and how he wrestled with protecting his family than it would be for him searching the family. So it's just a direction that I took as an author. It's just one of the propelling forces of the book. You know, why does he continue to move? Why doesn't he just stay hunkered down in his house, in his basement with his dog and never leave the house? It's because he wants to be reunited with his family. And so that's kind of why I made that decision. Alessandra asked, why was New York off the communication grid? Good question. And again, although it's unfortunate that I can use our own reality as an example, if you have been keeping up with the news at all, you know that a lot of the coronavirus or the COVID-19 cases, the majority of those come from major cities, because in a major city, the population density is a lot higher, meaning there are more people per square mile than in rural places like Kentucky or Tennessee or wherever. And so we assume, we don't know for sure, but we assume that places like New York, Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, those major metropolitan areas in the book went off of the communications grid because the population density allowed for the disease to spread a lot faster. All right, and so kind of like today, the more people that are around, the easier it is for the coronavirus to spread. So that, which is why it's so important to self-isolate. Same deal here. The more people that are in a given area, the faster TBR can spread. How it spreads, we don't really know yet as far as the book goes, but we do know that it is spreading. Devin asked, my question for the month is about the people. And Devin says that, played a lot of zombie games and movies, and they all seem to be dead mentally, but the people in this story seem to have a memory and a consciousness. And so what is going on with their brains, and are they decaying slowly, and do they still have a consciousness they're clinging onto? And so again, it's kind of like one of the other questions that we had. We kind of think that there must be some sort of consciousness. Mr. Harrison is a good early example of how they just aren't zombies, right? If it was a zombie book, then it would all be about, let's just get rid of these zombies. Zombies are just this random act of evil. And so killing a zombie doesn't really have any consequences. There's no saving them. But if it's someone who is just simply infected, then there's always a chance that there could be a cure, and maybe locked in there somewhere, even though they look crazy, they could still be cured because they are still human on the inside. And so that's kind of one of the major elements of the book in terms of what Marlon deals with, because each time he confronts one of the people infected with TBR, he's not just confronting some sort of dead-faced animal. He's confronting something that might still be, for all intents and purposes, human. And so that's kind of where we're at in the book. Johanna asks, my question for the author is, does the disease transfer straight to your blood or to your brain? Good question. We don't really know at this point. We'll find out later in the book when Marlon discovers more. But like all infections, you think about when you get a cold or when you get the flu, it can be transmitted with a cut in your skin, or it can be transmitted through the membranes in your eyes, through your nostrils, through your mouth. Sometimes it can even get in through your ear. You just don't know. So there are multiple ways that the TBR could probably enter your system, blood being one of them, or it might go from your blood straight to your brain, and that's why it affects you so much mentally. We don't quite know yet, but we will by the end of the book. Beth Z asks, my question for the author is, where in the body does the disease spread to and how fast? So clearly, based on what we know just from the month of April, that it affects strength and it affects the mind. So it has to be something that affects your mentality, because what inhibits you as a person from causing a lot of bodily harm is what your nervous system says to your muscles. And so if your nervous system is blocked, or if it doesn't say, hey, this hurts, then you can do a lot more than whenever you do have this nervous system response. So, why did it take 5 shots to kill that guy? It might not necessarily be because he had some sort of superhuman tendency. It could have been simply because he didn't feel getting shot, and so the shock of those gunshots didn't really affect him as much. Okay, something to think about. The next question is from Kylan. When you were writing this book or story, did any of the topics you talked about actually happen to you or someone around you? So similar to another question that we had, but again, most authors, especially if you want to create a book, you're going to use things that you know, and then you're going to create fictional versions of that. Okay, so if I was to write a book about cheerleading, I've never been a cheerleader. I would have to do a lot of research on cheerleading and all that it goes into. Could I write a book about cheerleading and have a cheerleader as the protagonist? Probably. Would it be nearly as good as someone who was a cheerleader at some point, who was writing and could base their own experiences and put them into the book? My writing would definitely not be as great as that. And so, any writer, especially any aspiring writer, write what you know and then create a story from that. So obviously didn't have a TBR outbreak in 2013 when I wrote the book, but I did have a family, still do, thankfully. But I had a family. I knew what it was like to be separated from a family. I knew what it was like to be guilty of working too hard, which is kind of what Marlon was doing at the beginning of the book. That's why he didn't join his family, because he had work to do. So I knew all of those things, and then I could spin that into the story. Let's see, we've got a few more here. Alejandra asked, how would it be, or how did he get through all of the things he had to go through? Like, for example, being so long apart from his family. Did he say he did say he missed them a lot, but how does he manage to find them? It must be very hard being apart from them and not being able to see them. Absolutely, and that is what he struggles with throughout the entire book, is where his family is not completely known. Marlon believes that they are at Barclay Lodge, or he hopes that they are. He got a phone call from Anne, his wife, a couple days before the outbreak started. But did they leave? Did they try and go back home? Did they try to go contact his relatives? Did they go south? Did they go north? Did they go east? Did they go west? He doesn't know. And because communications are down, because you can't reach them, because you don't know anything that's going on in the rest of the United States or in the rest of the world, Marlon is very lonely. So that's one of the reasons why, as the author, I chose to have him write in his journal. Because if you yourself have ever written in a journal or a diary or anything like that, you know that you can write about the day's events, but in writing about the day's events, you can also rediscover and reflect on your feelings. And so as we go through the book, as we progress, we'll see that Marlon, he still writes about the day's events, and that's how we as readers know what's going on. But he also writes a lot about what he's feeling emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and that's how we discover how he grows and how conflict occurs throughout the story. Okay. All right. The next question we've got is Abraham. Where did the family go on vacation? I assume you mean Marlon Hartman. They went to Barkley Lodge in Kentucky at Barkley Lake. Now, my own family, they had actually gone to stay with my parents for a few days. My kids had actually, whenever I was writing the book. That's kind of what inspired me, because although there thankfully was nothing serious going on in 2013, not having my children in the house, and it's sort of quiet, especially when my wife had gone to work and everything, it was just me in the house alone. You start thinking about, well, if I had been separated from my family, what would it feel like? Especially the longer that time period goes. And so, in the book, they apparently went on vacation. Marlon did not go. He was too busy working. But, he kind of regrets that, and we'll see how he regrets that as we go through the book. Cesar asked, I don't understand why he can't go into town. He has a car. Marlon has a car. That's very true. The best thing I can say about why he just doesn't get up and go immediately is kind of the same as what we are experiencing now. Could I get into my car right now and could I drive around town? Yes, I could. But what would I do, once I got into town? A lot of businesses are closed because of the pandemic that we're experiencing right now. Walmart has certain hours, and they've spaced out how many people can go into the store at one time. So have a lot of the pharmacies where I live right now. And then even when you do go to those places, you do hear about the risk of contracting COVID-19. And even though, health officials say it probably isn't going to be very serious if you get the illness, 80% of people only have mild symptoms. There is that small risk. And so even with that small risk that we have as Americans today, there are still a lot of people that are reluctant to go out because they don't want to take that risk. And so you have to think about, if Marlon Hartman sees all of these strange and horrible things just from outside of his window, and he hears these weird screams, and there's no more traffic on the roads, that fear that something serious could be happening in town is going to keep him mentally locked down in his house. So he, in a way, is choosing to self-isolate for as long as possible, because if you're isolated, you're protected until something comes to you. Or like in the case of Marlon Hartman, he doesn't have much choice but to eventually leave. And so that's why he decides to finally go. There's nothing left for him to do there, so he decides to go. And then I think we've got one more question here from Michelle, and that is, why didn't the author keep smoke alive? That was actually a very challenging part of the story for me. As far as an author goes, I had debated whether or not Smoke should stick by Marlon Hartman for the rest of the book, or if Smoke should disappear, or if Smoke should, do whatever. And then finally I decided that, if you had a pet, especially a dog, man's best friend, what would that best friend do for their owner? If I had a dog and someone broke into my house, or if I had a dog and there was a coyote outside because there's a field outside of my house, that dog would start barking. That dog would want to break free of her leash. She would want to go attack that enemy, even to the point of her own death, right? And so for me, even though it was a very dramatic part of the book, I knew that Smoke would need to make that sacrifice so that Marlon could live. But even beyond that, there are a few logistical things as an author in terms of the book. I wanted to be as realistic as possible. I didn't want to take away from Marlon's story and have Marlon worrying about, how does Smoke get enough to eat? How does Smoke not run away all the time? Does Smoke go out and use the bathroom at night, whenever there are, these infected people roaming around? So a lot of things that would make it more difficult to tell the story, especially knowing where I wanted Marlon to go by the end of the story. Smoke was one of those characters that had its place. Smoke was essential at the beginning of the story, but it was unfortunately necessary for Smoke to meet her end in that way. So I hope it was, a glorious way for Smoke to go, man's best friend defending, their owner. But again, that one was a hard decision to make. Okay, so I think that was all of the questions for the month of April for that chapter. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about May, or if I totally missed the mark on what you're going for one of those questions, feel free to ask it again. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you continue enjoying the book. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.